Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar installment with Brian Patterson of Emerge Alliance. Today, we are going to be talking about the role of microgrids for power surety during national emergencies. To start, we're going to do a few background rules and how you can ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll try to answer all your questions at the end. We might not get to all of them, but we'll do our best to respond to individuals after the webinar concludes. So first off, at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat feature. You can directly chat with all the panelists, including Chuck and Brian. And then there's also a Q&A button. You can click on that and ask your questions. And again, at the very end of this webinar, we'll go through the Q&A. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. At the conclusion of this presentation, we'll make a video recording live to all attendees as well. And one last note for everyone on here, if you're interested in more webinars about microgrids, you can go to events.solar and click on the first tab there that says Think, Engage, Connect. And there's a listing of all future webinars that we'll be hosting over the next couple months here. And thank you to our sponsors. Without our sponsors, this webinar and future webinars wouldn't be possible. So we're really grateful that all these companies helped step up and we're able to have Brian and Chuck for this webinar. So without further ado, I'll introduce Brian Patterson. Brian is the founder and chairman of the board at Emerge Alliance. Emerge Alliance is an industry partner with SPI, ESI, and North America Smart Energy Week, which is taking place this September. Brian?
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Greg. I wanted to start out by, we didn't put a long bio up here, so if you want to know more about Emerge or myself, please check into the website and you can see what it is that we're all about. But the focus today is really about national emergencies and how the power grid and microgrids interact in that respect. So we put a lot of this together based on questions that a lot of you had submitted at the time that you registered. So we're going to try to answer as many of those as we can. I apologize ahead of time that if we don't hit your question, we'll eventually get to it. And if not in this webinar, there's 8 more webinars in the series that will be on related subjects that hopefully we'll get to you. But I wanted to start out with a question for everybody. And that is, while we're thinking about the questions that you asked, I'd like you to think about what's going on with this whole coronavirus outbreak and how obviously terrible it is and how empathetic I think we all are for those who've lost their lives and so on. But it's another yet painful reminder of sort of the canary in the coal mine. So I'd like you to kind of look at my little graphic here, cartoon or whatever, and I don't mean to make light of it, but you'll notice that the canary now has a N95 mask on, in addition to being subject to all the other natural and other disaster influences around it. The question is, how many disasters can we have that threaten the grid and before we take the message seriously and really start to do something about it? And so the question, while you're counting how many disasters could happen, what would happen if they were coincidental? Right now we're all probably sitting huddled in our own homes, fairly comfortable in some respects, maybe socially apart, but fairly comfortable. And that's because a lot of the technology around us is assisting our connectivity with our fellow humans. But imagine if the power went out right now, and if it went out for a considerable period of time. We'd likely sit in the same place huddled in the dark. And if you think that's a little far-fetched, I can tell you that just the other day, about a week and a half ago, I was on a conference similar to this. And there were several people on the conference line. We were all collaborating, the normal way, asking about how everybody was handling the pandemic and so on. And all of a sudden the power went out in my house, in my neighborhood, in fact, in this whole area. It immediately struck me as some kind of crazy coincidence, but the power didn't come back on right away. And I started really thinking about that, and really the genesis for a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And I picked up the phone and I called a friend of mine that has been a long-term expert on resiliency, Chuck Manto, who's on the line here with us. And by the way, we're all working, at home, just like you see on TV and all that. We're kind of sheltered in place or what have you. And Chuck, when I met him a couple of years ago, he was involved in, and still is, in something called the InfraGard. And so I got to know him because InfraGard, as you can probably imagine, is about infrastructure and how it needs to be guarded against threats and disasters and so on. Chuck's also the CEO of a company called Instant Access Networks, and Instant Access Networks is a consulting firm that does R&D and really works on EMP protected microgrids. A lot of it focused on telecommunication networks and data centers, but generally across the board in the form of that particular threat. He has recently, I'm proud to say, joined Emerge Alliance as a governing board advisor. And most notably, he's the author of 7 books about infrastructure and resiliency, one of which I'm going to talk about in a little while, which is about the resilience of power and other things for hospitals. And it was interesting because Chuck wrote the book, Chuck, and you might want to comment when I finish here, but you wrote the book 3 years ago, at least, I think. But in the context of that book, in the middle of it, you absolutely described almost in impeccable detail the kind of current situation that we're in. So for all those people that thought, oh, that'll never happen, it happened, and Chuck was very prophetic in having written it into his book at the time. So welcome, Chuck, and thanks for joining us today. Are you there, Chuck?
I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
There you go.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Absolutely.
I'm glad to be here.
So tell us, Chuck, I met you in, the InfraGard organization. It's some kind of a collaboration between private and public organizations. What is InfraGard, and what are you trying to do there? Or what is InfraGard trying to do?
Well, as you mentioned, InfraGard is one of these 501c3 organizations, in this case, instituted and sponsored by the FBI. And what they do is they give background checks to anyone who's in critical infrastructure, and everyone on the call is basically one of those kinds of folks. And with a simple background check, you can be admitted into the group, and you then get law enforcement level, information about security as it impacts your industry. And you have the opportunity then to meet with people in your local community, maybe every couple of months or so, on topics that you choose. And every one of those meetings has someone from the FBI present, because they maintain very active involvement with that group. There are about 75, 80 some chapters around the country, and there's probably 50 to 70,000 members at any point in time. And then I helped create a national program for them in 2011 that looked at any infrastructure threat that could impact the country as a whole for 30 days or longer.
Yeah, that's quite amazing, because when I was looking at some of the membership, particularly on the government side, I was surprised to see the CIA is in there, Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. Even the National Guard units out of states and federal level, the military, DOD, DOE is in there. So it's just a real interesting kind of amalgam of all of the government side. But then there's a very long list of commercial and private establishments as well. So it's a pretty robust group, it looks like.
Yes, and membership is simple because only individuals actually join it. So you might be an individual employee or staff of any one of those groups, but the organization doesn't join, you as an individual joins. Although all of those groups participate off and on in various programs that they have around the country, and certainly in the national level programs we did in what was originally called the Electromagnetic Pulse Special Interest Group, and now it's called the National Disaster Resilience Council.
Well, we don't want to get hung up too long on the subject. We could probably talk all day about InfraGard, but for people that want to know about it, just Google InfraGard and you can go to the website there and check it out. But as a part of that, Chuck, what I found out is that you in particular, having led some parts of that organization, had really kind of wrung out this exploration of what are the vulnerabilities of our national, local, regional, state infrastructures. So could you talk a little bit about how you see that? What are the vulnerabilities, and what do we need to be wary of?
Well, you know, we have a somewhat good understanding in society. If you're involved in infrastructure, what are the things that could impact you? What we were focusing on, though, are particular threats that have the capability of impacting an infrastructure more than just in your state or region, but across the country, and for a period longer than 30 days. And one of the reasons we care about those, and that doesn't matter if it's electromagnetic pulse, an extreme space weather event, a cyber attack, a coordinated physical attack, or a pandemic, any of those, if large enough or in combination with another, could not only impact you for 30 days or longer, but it could also have indirect impacts on other infrastructures as well. So they have a cascading effect. It's sort of like a house of cards that all come down. And the reason why that's important to think about is that normally we've prepared to handle smaller regional problems like a Hurricane Katrina or a Hurricane Sandy, when the rest of the country can, rally together and come to our aid. But there may be a level of problem that could hit the country pretty much as a whole, making it less likely that timely help would come for you where you are. And that means that in cases like that, we have to really think about how to be so resilient at our local level that when the centralized systems collapse, we're still going to be okay.
Yeah, when I was sitting here and the power went out just a week and a half or two ago, I did almost kind of go through the mental checklist of, okay, if this persists for a while, what am I going to do in various situations? And quite a bit later, several hours, the power reluctantly, almost flickering, kind of came back on. And the first thing I did after, we all run around and set the clocks again and all our electronics, but I also checked for how many batteries I had, and was threatening to make a run to the store until my wife grabbed me and said, no, you got to shelter in place, so stay here. But it seriously, it was a really unnerving kind of reminder of what the vulnerabilities are of all these infrastructures, especially as they could cascade. And when we talked earlier, you gave me some examples, and maybe you have some anecdotal stories yourself about failures where we came to near misses or partials that really underscored for your thinking and brought your passion on the subject up. Could you talk a little bit about some of those?
Sure. Well, the slide you have up now on extreme space weather is a really pertinent one. For example, during Hurricane Maria, and that hit Puerto Rico not too long ago, the very first day, there was a small space weather event which disrupted emergency HF communications for the first day. And that was very frustrating. The day you needed it most, it wasn't available to you. Fortunately, it was a short-term event. In the past, we've had larger events which, burned out or taken out transformers in Quebec in 1989, and periodically, usually closer to the poles, but around the country and around the world, this has been something space weather experts normally think about. In fact, this last week was going to be an annual meeting of those space weather experts in Colorado. They have what they call the Space Weather Workshop each year, and we're usually there. Of course, because of the Corona event, it got postponed. So the one that you have on the screen is the most telling, because we all know somewhat about the 1859 Carrington event, where telegraph infrastructure was damaged. And the sense is that if we had an event like that today, we could have 8 to 18 month long, certainly Northeast blackout, likely continental blackout. And it was in 2012, according to that slide, we had one of these really large solar storms where a large amount of plasma, magnetically oriented plasma coming right to Earth. And fortunately, we scooted out of the path by about a week, but it still hit our satellites, and we collected a treasure trove of data from that. And what we realized in looking at that, and we spoke about this at our annual conferences at Infraguard's group that we organized, we realized that we would have taken the hit that would have resulted in a year-long blackout in the country. And what was coincidental about that, if you recall, even though that missed us in July of 2012, if we had been at the beginning of a 12 to 18 month blackout in the country, starting in July, you recall what happened in October, November. We had Hurricane Sandy. And imagine what would have happened if we had no warning about Hurricane Sandy and those guys would have been blindsided, how many unnecessary deaths there would have been. And then our ability to respond to help them would have been curtailed because we would have all had problems of our own because we would have been in the third of an 18-month blackout. So whenever you have something like a disaster, especially pandemics, it just reminds us that going through a pandemic such as the one we are in now does not make us immune to another natural or man-made disaster at the same time.
Yeah, it's interesting. Ironically, this one is also the effect of a corona. In this case, a corona from the sun, right? So
a coronal mass ejection, yes.
Yeah, so that's a kind of a coincidental but scary thought about things that you don't normally think about. And I know a lot of people dismiss things like space weather and near atmosphere nuclear explosions and things like that. But there have been some real examples and near misses, and it's just according to the scientists and statisticians, it's just a matter of time. And then the question is, whether they're coincidental with other things, as you suggest. The 30 days is an interesting thing because one would think that, we're pretty prepared. I mean, people have been worried about resilience for a long time. There's been doctrines out there that talk about emergency plans and emergency readiness, and people do drills and all that kind of stuff. So what was wrong with the way we used to think in the old doctrines that existed for years and years on this subject?
Well, I think we're getting better at it over time. The more we practice and ask ourselves hard questions, the better we're getting. But most people will recall that our emergency preparedness doctrine had said if everybody just had 3 days of food and water, whatever, so you can shelter in place for 3 days, that would be fine because in day 4 we would rescue you. And of course, after Katrina and a few of these others, we're realizing, well, maybe it ought to be a week, or maybe it ought to be a little more than a week, okay? And but the problem with that thinking, especially when you're down to say, I just need 3 days of food and water because the government will rescue me, I really don't need to be prepared at all. It actually undermines preparedness. Because if I just had, say, some water for a few days, I could go without eating for a few days, and maybe, unless I'm a diabetic or something like that. And that means I really shouldn't put any time or money into preparedness, because it just puts me or my organization at a competitive disadvantage to being prepared when I could just be more efficient and in my everyday life. So certain kinds of, yes, go ahead.
I was going to say, so how has that thinking changed? Is there new preparedness doctrine, and what is it saying about all this?
Well, we've been encouraging people to shift. And since everybody was tied into that number 3 number and having 3 days of stuff ready, I've been encouraging people to think of having 3 days of supplies as something you could take with you along with your to-go kit, but have 3 months of preparation at your home or your business as this minimum. Now, people should really be thinking probably of a year or 2, but they haven't begun that process normally, and it may just seem overwhelming. But if people start the process of saying, okay, I know for sure I have enough in my home or business to operate for 3 months, they're going to be on their way to thinking So how do I go to 5 months, to 8 months, to 12 months, to 20 months, and so on? And if you could think about it well, then you can realize there are relatively inexpensive ways to do it. And it's not impossible at all. In fact, it becomes inexcusable to not do it.
Okay,
but
so
you have to shift people's thinking.
Yeah, so you kind of changed the time frame of thinking process, that domain. But it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about, though, are still relatively short-term fixes, right? When things get damaged or what have you, isn't there ways to do something else? And I put this list, which I pulled from some of your work on Infragard. And there's a lot that people are already doing in these, what I think are relatively short-term fixes, because really they're recognizing that the disaster occurs and that damage is going to be done, as opposed to saying, is there a way to prevent the damage? Is there a way to prevent the disaster from having the kind of impact that it has in the first place?
Well, and that's true. And the benefit of looking at the really large ones or worst case scenarios, for example, if you have a military organization, you don't want to prepare your military to just win little skirmishes and say, well, if anybody declares a big war on us, we'll just surrender right up front. That's unacceptable, right?
Right.
And so we need to have our homeland security capable of worst case disasters as well, and not say, well, if it's really bad, we'll just give up and go home. The problem is our infrastructure is designed, because we have maximized efficiency by minimizing resiliency. We've designed our infrastructure in such a way that we all will shut down our doors and go home the day we are needed most, which is really unacceptable. And when you think about how do you manage in these worst case scenarios, and you think about it for any length of time, and you work with other people who will help you work out those issues with you, you'll find out the only way to really do a good job is if you redevelop your infrastructure in such a way that everything you need to carry on is producible locally. So you do a certain amount of your own local food, you do your own local water, you do local communications, and you also do local energy. And in energy, especially thinking of ways to do local energy that you produce and store, so that if you never get an electron from someplace far away, if you never get a drop of oil or a whiff of gas from someplace far away, your core capabilities are going to be able to function indefinitely. That's what you really want to do. And then you have to figure out, how do you pull that off technically? And then how do you pay for it? Or better yet, how do you get somebody else to pay for it?
Yeah, so it's almost like the basics here, that power is almost at that foundation of capability, that if you don't protect it and lose it somehow, that everything else kind of is downstream and gets impacted. So, and that's what intrigued me about the work that you guys were doing, or you folks are doing, is that more and more focus was being excuse me, put on electric power, excuse me, and the grid and its vulnerabilities to try to prevent these kind of cascading losses, both within the power system and then as a result of the power system itself being lost. And I pulled out this kind of goal set that it seemed was the result of a lot of that work, and it really does kind of at its core focus on power. And power systems, and just having backup power for yourself doesn't prevent the rest of the community or the rest of the neighborhood or the rest of the state or what have you from having a problem. And we saw that even with the pandemic, where some states had very little impact, but that didn't prevent the entirety of the airline system to be impacted, and all the other things that cascaded from the health of the pandemic. So it really is enlightening and sobering to see that the power is that almost fundamental critical infrastructure that we really have to do a better job at. So that brings me to the subject of microgrids, because a lot of what people are talking about, and we've been working on the smart grid and getting better switching capability and metering and things like that into the grid, so we know what's going on in the grid. But there's fundamentally a vulnerability to the grid today that needs to be mitigated, and often that brings up the discussion of microgrids. Could you talk us through a little bit about fundamentally why microgrids are so important?
Yes, and in your slide, you mentioned, for example, problems that could be large and relatively permanent. All you have to do is, if you're in the power industry or any other for that matter, you can do an analysis of saying, what's my mean time to repair or the mean time to replace anything I happen to have? So if it all goes away in an instant or part of it does, how fast would you be able to get the replacement parts to get back on your feet? And as you know, in the power industry, sometimes it might take a year or so to get back on your feet. That's why you need to think through these local systems that you can have in advance so that you can withstand it. And the other interesting thing that you have in this is, 2/3 of the way down, you talk about operational islanding as compared to social distancing. I think that's very timely. We're all aware of what social distancing means at the moment. But the military, who does a lot of this planning, realizes that they have to make certain that their essential functions, like somebody in a missile silo, for example, can continue to operate in island mode, even though all the other surrounding systems have collapsed. And this is very similar to thinking of people who do space systems or aircraft and sometimes sea systems, where you basically have to operate autonomously, at least autonomously from everyone else. And that's a goal you want to be able to have for your microgrid. And microgrids are important because they're inherently capable of doing that if you design them well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the corollaries here between some of the human behavior around the dealing with the pandemic, social distancing, and things like that, and how that really applies to technical systems as well. And looking at this whole subject, excuse me, I found a term that was called halonic, and it's actually holonic rather, HOLONIC is the word, but it really described where something is both a part of a system, but it also is a system itself, or is the whole. Or the Greek, I guess the Greek word holon meant that it can be a whole or it can be a part of a larger whole. And I thought about that, and I said, because a lot of people say, oh, I got a microgrid, I can go off grid, now I don't have to worry about anybody else, get away from whoever it is that I'm trying to get away from with utility or my utility bills or whatever. But really, a isolated microgrid loses that connectivity. It's like being sheltering in place, you no longer have the advantage of networking or being connected to other people. And if something does happen in your system or in your microgrid, there's nobody connected to you that can help. So, and there's just a myriad of benefits, I guess you'd call it, that you can get by connecting in to a larger network, even if it's a network of peered microgrids or a network of hierarchically configured microgrids or what have you. So that you can, as events that might disrupt the power system pass or in fact become longer to repair, you can kind of reconfigure the network around the damage or the interrupted portions and still have a usable grid, which is critical in a lot of ways. So it kind of limits the scale and maybe even the length of any disruption by being able to quickly reconfigure, if not instantaneously reconfigure the grid. Is that a fair way of looking at this?
Yeah, I think the idea of being able to be instantly islandable. So, for example, if you have an electromagnetic attack that hits you within nanoseconds, to automatically or have built in the ability to be immune from that. And similarly, say cyber attacks or other things. Yes, you are operating in an island, but as you suggested, islands may want to communicate with each other, or you may want to share resources with each other, such as power. So one of the things we think about, or the way I talk about it, is it's great to be in island mode or fully autonomous so you can operate as long as you need to on your own. But it's also great to be in connection with other islands, or what I would call an archipelago, because then you can be helpful to each other. Utilities can play a huge role in something like this because, as you know, if you're going to share power across a property line, you need to be regulated so you don't go killing your neighbors. And so microgrids, while they are designed best maybe as behind the meter applications, they need to link with each other in front of the meter to take advantage of sharing communications, or in many cases, you could make excess power that you don't need. You can sell it to the market and help pay for your own microgrid. And that kind of sharing, that has a real-time opportunity to look at supply and demand, can make it possible for you to fully fund your microgrid, not only from the savings you make by the electricity you don't have to buy from the utility, but from the money you could earn by working with your utility to sell it into the market, and so that the utility themselves can make some money based on the investment that you've made in your microgrid. So it's a way that all the parts can be better as parts, and as a whole be better as well.
Yeah, I kind of look back at the whole evolution of the information system based on initially on microprocessors and when they work their ways into personal computers. And I kind of look at a lot of what's going on in microgrids initially as being sort of personal power systems, or the equivalent of personal computers in the information world. And while they're,
that's a very good idea. A very good illustration, because if you remember the mainframe computer, and you had a big IT department, and all you had was a monitor, and you could do no programming on your own. And anytime you needed something, you had to go get the IT department to do that for you. Now you have distributed computing, distributed intelligence. You could do the same thing with distributed energy, including storage.
And I know back in the mainframe days, when the mainframe went down or had any issues of capacity, the first order of allocation of that capacity went to the CEO and the CFO, who ran the accounting department, and the rest of you, went back to writing on the back of the lunch bag. But seriously, the personal computer really didn't pay for itself in spades until it got networked, right? When we connected everything with now what we call the internet. Now it has taken on not only the personal computer, but our personal communication devices that we carry around, our cell phones and all that. They are almost indispensable in terms of value. So when I think about, what's the value of doing all this, I think about that metaphor and say that we have yet to see all of the value that is going to come from a network of microgrids and the grid itself, the bulk grid. And as I went down through your work and other people's work and made this list of the value of microgrids. And it really does, you can start out with resiliency and define that in whatever terms resilient capability, avoids the losses and cost and so on. But there are so many other benefits in operation, both at the what I call the local level, as I say, the whole, and when it's islanded, but also as part of the grand system, if you will, where the value of the network just takes on a whole new meaning. And I don't think we've seen, as we explore how much electricity will be used for the future as we go to future electric vehicle transportation, and if you believe Elon Musk, electric airplanes and so on and so forth. I think we're at the beginning of a long evolution of the increased use in electricity, because it is such a workable commodity to move around in terms of electrons. So it kind of is a common denominator that really bears being careful with. And I notice in the work that you've done with the government and in particular the military, that this concept of creating an archipelago, or as I call it, the grid of grids, sort of a modular system that can be adaptive and reformed. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? I put one of your slides up here so you can show people what you're.
Sure, and that word resilient is important because you have to ask yourself, resilient to what, or resilient in what context? And for example, the same way with microgrids. Microgrids are inherently easier to protect, and the EMP protection is easier to do and maintain, but it's not automatic. If you're trying to do this, you have to be very thoughtful and intentional up front and come up with standards like the military standards as objective benchmarks that you can not only can meet, but you could have a third-party independent testing group validate that you've met them. So we've talked about this as a concept of a microgrid system, which includes the loads, so that the microgrid can be thought of as modules. And as modules, you can bring the right modules in the right place for the right application. And so if you have an overall concept of a modular approach that's integrated and adaptable and at least semi-intelligent, you can almost come up with like a universal microgrid solution, not because one size fits all, but you have so many different modules that you can, in fact, put the right modules in the right place. So you can customize something on one hand without having the expense of a customized system.
And you mentioned that no matter whether you're talking about physical protection of these modules or whatever you'd like to call each of the domains, or as you've worked a lot on the electromagnetic protection, but also the whole notion of cyber influences and cybersecurity. If you close the system into these islanded modules whenever there's a cyber threat, you have a better chance of survivability, don't you?
Yes, and on the cyber side too, sometimes it's more complicated than people think, because you not only have all the typical information technology controls with computers, you also have these industrial controls that people in operations, not necessarily IT, are doing. And so you need to have a holistic view of all of the threats within your organization, within the technology, but also in the environment. So having a really big picture approach to this is helpful. And then you could take all the things that you learn about electromagnetic protection and cyber protection and bring that to bear. And also work with your collaborators, not only in your supply chain, but in your environment. So the other people you need to work with can do the same thing.
I want to get to the next couple of slides, and I'll go quickly here, but there's many people have the notion that a microgrid is a very definable size and scale and so on in application. But actually, I don't think, at least what I've seen, is that microgrids really are a family of solutions, and one size doesn't fit all. Even one configuration doesn't fit all. So I put together the next couple slides just to talk about these end markets. You know, there are microgrids that people talk about at the municipal and public level, utility scale, I'll call them. There are certainly community and neighborhood microgrids. I showed that little diagram on the previous slide was from the Brooklyn microgrid. And also microgrids that go right down to the building level, whether it's a home or an office building or a factory or what have you. And campuses, whether there's educational or health care campuses and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different end applications. And as a result, there's lots of different configurations and scale. If you look even at the utility level, I don't think there's any two microgrids that would be the same, although their fundamental topology and construct are similar. Same thing with community town microgrids and things like that that are backing up emergency services and other town functions. And then of course residential, but again, it's not a single residential, it's not just single family homes, it's multiple family homes and attached housing and apartment buildings and all of which have different requirements and different uses. So the configurations obviously need to be different. And then of course you get into the industrial realm, you know, of use cases, everything from remote cell towers to retail stores and food processing plants and military bases and data centers. And I mean, you just name it, they're all out there, both technical microgrids and building microgrids and so on and so forth, healthcare, hospitality, even convention centers. You know, we've had live microgrids that we do at the at SPI and North America Smart Energy Week, right at the convention center. So we're actually using a microgrid to power part of the convention. So all of these cases are important, but there's one that, like I said early on, that it really struck me about one of the books that you wrote, which is called Resilient Hospitals Handbook, described absolutely in spades the situation that we are now in with the pandemic, and what it is that hospitals and healthcare facilities and things like that really need to understand about their power systems and so on. But I don't want to just say that, oh, we can solve the problem for hospitals and we're good. That only refers to this coincidental or potential of coincidence of affecting healthcare. But everything could be affected. You know, we come out of the pandemic and get hit by a tornado or you know, God forbid, a nuclear threat or what have you, and we'll be in a different set of circumstances. But this book that you wrote, and it's an easy read, by the way, for those who want to grab it. You can go on Amazon or a number of different locations I put on the screen here. But it really does kind of, for me, it kind of coalesced the whole notion of what resilience is all about and why it's so important. Any comments on your book, Chuck? It was written, what, 3 years ago?
Yeah, in 2017. First of all, my co-authors are like top in the world in what they do. One used to work for Northcom, looking at what happens if the government had to take over all healthcare under martial law. And Dr. Motzer had been a CEO of a hospital for 50 years and advised HHS and also the National Security Council. Top guys, far more expertise in the medical community than I would ever hope to have. And it was an honor to work with these guys in this production. But yeah, I think what you'll see when you look at all the hazards and all the infrastructure, and then you look at all the resources we have at our disposal, every manner of generating and storing power, there's a role for everyone here. And it's just, in fact, even when you're putting complex things together and you need to work with, you know, geothermal, wind, solar, hydro, there's still a role for, you know, gas and, you know, a propane backup source and so on. All of those things have a role as long as you think of this as being local, so that at any one particular site, you use anything at your disposal to be able to be capable of working indefinitely without the help of anyone else. But then you as you mentioned, it can expand it. And in that booklet, we show you the multiple threats that could impact the hospital. And the reason why hospitals are great to think about, most of the people we talk to in life, our friends, people in our community, we don't have a lot of background on all this infrastructure stuff. It's all over our head, and we hope really smart and caring people are managing it. But everybody's been in a hospital, just like everybody's seen the National Guard. You love them or hate them. And if those two organizations can go public with the message that we don't want to quit and go home the day you need us most, we are addressing our fragility, and we are taking the responsibility to making, you know, in the case of a hospital, they have to do emergency, critical loads, and life safety loads. If they can do it on their campus or right next door, so they could never shut down their doors, you know, even though the grid goes away for years, that would be the ideal circumstance. Now, in some cases, it's easier to get there than others. In some cases, you can do it where the microgrid pays for itself, or you could actually make money selling it to someone else. And the microgrid that's not in your budget could actually bring you more money than you thought you had. But in other cases, you're going to fall short, and you're going to have to get a little creative to figure out how to make it work. And that's why all of us need to work together to think these things through, so we could do a more capable job of loving our families and our communities the way we would like to, but haven't been challenged to do so yet until a day like today, when we're in the middle of a pandemic.
Thank you, Chuck. I'm going to move us along, but I did want to put this up because I think, again, and you know, I'm a big nut on analogies and metaphors. But if you study the hospital handbook, you can almost apply the same thinking process to all of the infrastructure that uses electric power. But one of the questions I often get asked is, what inventions are needed? What's holding us back? Why aren't we doing this? You know? And I said, really, being a long time follower of a lot of different technologies and an inventor myself, I said, really, we don't need anything technically. We've invented everything we need. But there are inventions necessary, but they're all in human systems, not in the technology. And so I don't know if there's a complete list, but I put together this list for people to think about. You know, we need new business models, we need new regulatory structure, et cetera, all the way down this list. The one thing we need to do, and I think the message that you just espoused in your comments there, was that individually or at our company level, we need to take responsibility for this ability of being able to isolate the power system and protecting it against the catastrophic failure. And that's one of the messages we need to get to our local legislators and our regulatory people and so on and so forth, is that if we're going to be as successful as we were in doing sheltering in place and social distancing as we tried to stop the coronavirus, we need to do something similar in the power system. And that means that people are going to have to take responsibility. And in order to take responsibility, they have to have an understanding. And this webinar, frankly, as is the show that'll be in September, is all about trying to make people aware and also getting them educated to the point where they can take responsibility for what it is that we're talking about here. At the end of the day, though, you ask the question, is somebody else going to worry about this, or do I have to do it? Is it is resilient power a product, or is it a service? And so I put a couple of slides together in the hopes that maybe, Chuck, you might want to comment, or if not, just recognize that you can look at this as something that you own, sort of like a car, and that you have to take care of it, and the cost of ownership is something that you have to take into account, as well as the capital investment and so on and so forth, to reap the benefits of cost reduction and resiliency. Or you can look at it as a service, and whether it's third party or the current utility or a combination, there's a lot of public-private partnerships that are being formed now, which is really encouraging to see, where this whole notion of resilience around microgrids is a service model, and or a combination at least of hardware and service. So there's lots of options out there, but we do need people to think about all of those innovations and be really entrepreneurial as we bring this all into existence. And it should be as opportunity rich as was the whole boom behind the internet and all the things that now exist in commerce and companies and capability that now exist as a result of the internet. I think a similar kind of thing is going to happen with power. It's so fundamental. It just stands to reason that it's full of opportunity and opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship. I did want to talk a little bit about costs, and of course, when it comes about or affordability, really not cost, but affordability. And there's a couple of different ways to approach it. You either own it or you have somebody else owns it and sort of charge you as a service, or you have some kind of a partnership. And there's lots of those models for ownership out there. Sometimes it's easier for the more institutional enterprises to finance things in larger scale, but also there's lots of private capital that is generally available, maybe not right this minute unless you're in a PPP loan or something like that. But generally there's a lot of venture capital for entrepreneurs who are really looking at engaging in deployment of microgrids on a retail basis, if you want to look at it that way. I think at the end of the day, though, as I said, the microgrid, you've seen one microgrid, you've only seen one microgrid. Until you network them, you don't have the full value, doesn't get harvested. So for anybody who's worried about the affordability or the return on investment or the return on the total cost of ownership, think about the networking value. There's lots of logic out there that says that value can climb, and it tends to be exponential, if not logarithmic, in its value growth over its cost of deployment. So there's lots of opportunity to discuss that. I wanted to get to the end so that we have a few minutes for people to ask questions. And Greg.
Yeah, there's one I noticed already. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Chuck.
There's one in your last few slides. There's one that had popped up in the chat window about how is this playing out in the different states and what kind of policy changes need to be in place for the ideal technology and finance solutions to actually take hold. And I think it's a very good question because everybody's just sort of getting into understanding how this plays out, and different states have different policy, and the policies and regulations and so on will change still in the days and years ahead. So one of the things to think about is number one, go back to what do we do to all take responsibility, and if I have responsibility for my own life, and I have constitutional protections that allow me to do that. How do I do that effectively? And how do I keep my own constitutional rights from being taken away from me? On the other hand, how do I respect the rights to others and the safety requirements of doing things like, it's one thing for me to have my own solar panels and a battery in my home. That's the next thing is when I'm having to connect to the grid, I need to work with the grid to be able to do that. And so on. So there are policy issues and opportunities. And I think ultimately coming up with solutions where those at the local level can do well, but it helps the network as a whole. I think some combined capabilities like that are probably going to win the day.
And I think part of the leverage that the general citizenry has in trying to make some of these things happen, particularly with regard to regulatory change and so on, is to have as near as possible a common voice. And a lot of that comes as a result of being a part of trade organizations and like the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA, or SEIA, the solar people, the Solar Energy Industry Association, or Emerge, it works on standardization of some of this stuff. So there are organizations, and we're all trying to get on the same page relative to this message. Because if we can, then we walk in with a single voice to regulatory folks and others to make all this happen, financial people and so on. Part of the risk of financing.
Yeah, there's another question. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, part of the risk of financing all this is the uncertainty about, will things be interoperable? Will they all mesh together? So technical standards like the ones that Emerge does are really important, or the ones that, IEEE that we feed into, and ANSI and so on. They're all important. We're trying to write the early ones sort of as vanguard standards to get the ship off the launching pad. But yeah, it's all important, and those organizations, and that's part of why myself and Emerge are teamed up, and we're an industry partner with the SEIA and SEPA people to make all this happen. But you were going to say something, Chuck.
There was a question about there was a question from someone in the audience asking, what's the decision-making process to engage with hospitals and healthcare facilities? And it depends on the type of healthcare facility, but everything does start local, and it's important for local communities to get together and ask themselves, what kind of community do we want to have? What kind of healthcare do we want to have? What kind of facilities do we want to have? Hospitals happen to be organized and accredited by something called the Joint Commission. And so every hospital then has to, if they want that accreditation, they have to comply with what that organization that they're part of requires. And in those cases, hospitals self-identify what their emergency, critical, and life safety loads are. And then they have to demonstrate that they can meet certain needs. For example, having 3 days of power on hand or more, 3 or 4 days, depending on their circumstances. And they have to be able to show that, but they have to show that in a way that an independent auditor can see that they, in fact, are doing what they claim to do. So a lot of that is going back to where do you start? You can start with your local community, your local hospital, or whatever the entity is that you care about. And, just start with the people you know, or cold call some people and get to know them, or volunteer with them. You could do the same thing by working maybe with your volunteer fire department and working that way, or start going to your county and city meetings. We have a lot of political issues these days, and a lot of difficulty in political arenas that are obvious. But I think the biggest problem we've had in America is that too many people are not involved. Yeah. Too many people say, I'll let somebody else go to that city council meeting. It's boring. We don't even watch it on TV. We need to find out how we can connect with our local school board, our local community, and find ways to engage. And I think if we do that, we'll discover those connections.
Hey, we have just about 4 minutes left, and I wanted to quickly, and like I said before, we had lots of questions come in, and I apologize that we're just not going to be able to handle them all. But this is a series of webinars, so we're going to have 8 more, and they're really more than a webinar. They're more like a town meeting. We're going to invite experts from the field to come in on a variety of subjects, which you can see listed which I'll show you in a second. But all this kind of leads up to also the national event, which is in September, September 14th through 17 in Anaheim. And oh, by the way, acting locally, there's state level stuff and so on. I know Emerge and SEPA and SIA all engage with these activities at the state level and sometimes at the local level. But it is so critical, like you said, to engage right down to the town council, because all the authorities having jurisdiction, and the way that essentially our country operates is on a federalist system, really does, the most important piece is literally the feet on the ground locally. In any case, we will be talking about other things that are going to, at each of these webinars, or as I call them, town meetings. We're going to also highlight some different things that are going to happen in September at the conference. We're going to talk about the educational program and some of the summits that we're having. We're going to talk, for example, in California, we'll be talking about the public service power shutoffs and have a summit on that, focus on that, financing. We're going to have theaters all over the floor of the expo, focused on storage and EV infrastructure and microgrids and training and industry trends and all. So the event is really going to be, I think, the best ever. And we're going to focus on giving you little sneak peeks of what is going to roll out in the September event. If you want to register for that event ahead of time, registration is now open, I've been told, and I put the website up here, so you can go and register for that event in September. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the next 8, if you will, of these meetings. We're going to explore things that are a little bit more technical in some cases, and then others that are focused more on the market and some of the other relationships with the marketplace and opportunity. And you can see the schedule here. It goes all the way out through August. So all what we hope by the August 11th that we're starting to come out from our bunkers, and maybe we'll have a way of getting together physically. But until then, we have a wonderful series set up for you. And again, we'll be inviting experts from all these areas on all these subjects. But when you register for these, and you can go on to the SPI, the solar site, and register that website I just gave you, you need to register for each one of these, but you have the opportunity as a result of that to ask questions. And that really helps guide us, because we want this to be more like a town meeting. We want to hear from you. What are your ideas? What are your concerns? What are your questions about how to move this whole thing forward? All the webinars are going to be at 2 o'clock and all on Tuesday. So we're trying to figure out a way that we can send out a notice that you can plug all of this into your calendar to reserve some time. So we know that everybody is getting jammed up on the internet. But again, I'd like to also thank our sponsors. Without them, you know, it does take a few shillings, as they say, to make this all happen. So we thank them. Emera, who is, you can read their product line having to do with inverters and so on. And they will be at the show in booth 2904, so you can come out and see their products. Power Engineering is a consulting firm. Again, booth 2908 will be at the show. Mostly a lot, they really specialize a lot in integrating battery storage into your solar system. Lumen, again, taking a lot of storage and other, I guess, data points and things and pulling it all together in a management platform. And they're going to be at booth 688. And Emera Technologies. Emera is a national utility, but they have a division called Emera Technologies, who's introducing a whole new platform or product line, I guess, platform called Block Energy. And it is a multi-tiered microgrid platform that's essentially plug and play. And so they are also sponsoring this year our microgrid theater at SPI. So you definitely want to check in with them when you get a chance, and they'll be at the show. So Greg, that's it for us. If you have any last words, otherwise I'll thank everybody for attending today. You will get a copy or a link at least to the slides and everything from today's presentation. And sorry I went a couple minutes over, but thank you very much for joining us today, everybody. And please.